We have a special guest and speaker, and Josh Dean is our speaker. I'm going to read you his bio real quick here. Josh is a journalist, author, entrepreneur, and co-founded Campside Media. He's the creator and host of hit podcasts like The Clearing and Chameleon, and a longtime contributor to Rolling Stone and Outside magazines. His newest book, The Impossible Factory, explores the history of Lockheed's innovation machine, and all that they did there. And with that, Josh Dean.
Hi, I'm wearing this shirt. I am not an employee of Lockheed, nor am I an engineer, but I spoke there 2 days ago. Is this working?
You're on.
Okay. Spoke to the skunks themselves 2 days ago. I had to buy a shirt. I love this logo. I wrote this book. I'm a journalist, but also not a pilot. I'm guessing how many people in here are aviators themselves? Well, most of you. And any engineers? All right, you guys are the audience. Mechanics too, you also? Yeah. Okay, there's the three audiences basically. So I wrote this book. It sort of fell into my lap. So my last book was about Project Azorian, which if you don't know by that name is the story of the Glomar Explorer, the incredible, audacious CIA operation to steal a submarine off the bottom of the Pacific, 16,000 feet down. Incredible feat of engineering, incredible intelligence story. But Lockheed plays not a small role in there. Lockheed built the claw that went under the ship that grabbed the submarine. And so I dedicated a chapter in that, and there's a little bit of Kelly Johnson in that story because when the claw failed and they tried to go back a second time, Kelly went up with his metals expert and consulted on how to fix it. And when I was giving a talk about that book at Langley at CIA headquarters to a bunch of spooks, afterwards the historian came up to me and said, "Have you ever thought about doing a book on Kelly Johnson?" And I was like, "Surely there are tons of those." And he was like, "You'd be surprised." So I went and looked, and actually Kelly wrote an autobiography. It's about this thin. And his explanation was, he just never really was able to talk about the things that he did because they were all extremely secret and didn't feel like it was his place. And so he wrote a book that's very unsatisfying, I would say. And then Ben Rich wrote a great book about his time at the Skunk Works, which is called Skunk Works, and I would recommend anyone who's interested to read it. But it's very much through his focus, like his experience, and he's an incredible storyteller. Both were valuable assets to me, but I just felt like there hadn't been a definitive book about this incredible place. So I'm going to do a slideshow here that sort of walks you through the story, a lot of which you guys might know. Hopefully you'll learn some things, and then we can talk about it afterwards. So I'm actually going to sit down because I'm going to work from a script. And is it okay that you're going to film the slides, right?
Oh, yeah, sure.
All right.
You've got the little clicker there?
Yeah, I do.
Sure. Your chair's there, right?
Yeah. All right, yeah. Okay. Actually, you know what? I can stand. So that's Kelly Johnson. And behind him, the Blackbird. Still more than 50 years after it was built, the fastest air-breathing aircraft ever flown. This guy should be one of the most famous engineers of the 20th century, but outside of aviation and intel history world, almost nobody knows his name. Okay, that headline is hyperbole in this room. You guys obviously all know who Kelly Johnson is. But he probably should be, in my opinion, as famous as Henry Ford, but most Americans have never heard his name. And I wrote this book to tell his story and the story of the incredible place he built. And it started here, a handful of people in a former pottery factory where Robert Gross relaunched the company he bought out of bankruptcy for 40 grand in 1932, in a building with a leaky roof and no heating. Few people gave him a chance. Within a decade, Lockheed was turning out some of the most important warplanes in the world. Within 2 decades, they were building aircraft that reinvented the rules. How did that happen? It had a lot to do with one guy. Clarence Johnson, as he was known when he was born, grew up about as far from Burbank as you could get in those days, the UP, Michigan's Upper Peninsula. He was the son of Swedish immigrants, the seventh of 9 children. His father came to America with $600 in a dream of buying a ranch in Nebraska. He got as far as Chicago, was scammed, and ended up on a train to Michigan. He was out of money, he decided to stay, raised a family, became a bricklayer. His wife washed laundry. And Clarence was born there. He became Kelly after beating up a bully, and some of his friends decided he needed a tougher name than Clarence, something Irish, even though he wasn't Irish. So they picked Kelly out of a song. For the rest of his life, he became Kelly Johnson. Kelly grew up in true poverty, taking back streets home from school parades so his friends wouldn't see where he lived. But he spent every hour at the Carnegie Library reading about planes. At 12, he gave his first public speech. At the Lions Club, standing on a chair so he could be seen, it was on the future of aviation. At 16, he paid $5 for his first plane ride, an abbreviated trip in a biplane that took off, flew 700 feet, then the engine cut out. The pilot had to make an emergency landing. How did Kelly feel about that? He said, "It was fun, it was noisy, it was drafty, it was great." Which I think explains why he would go on to serve as the flight test engineer on all of his planes with the exception of the Blackbird, because there was nowhere for him to sit. In 1929, on the eve of the stock market crash, he enrolls at the University of Michigan. He was broke. His meal budget was so tight that he lived on donuts and milk. One semester, he ate 647 donuts. But he was at the best aeronautical engineering program in the country, studying with legends. He worked in the wind tunnel and discovered that he had a gift for understanding the way air moves over a surface. As one of his colleagues would later say, it's like Kelly can see air. He finished 3 years of coursework in two, then packed up and drove to Burbank to knock on the door of an upstart company called Lockheed, which turned him away. These were hard times. So Kelly drove back to Michigan, got his master's degree, and then drove west again in a car he'd modified for fuel economy to save money. This time, he got hired, $83 a month as a tool designer. He was 23. Then, on his very first week on the job, he told his new boss, Hal Hibbard, that the plane Lockheed was literally betting its future on, the Electra, was aerodynamically unstable. He said he could prove it, and he could fix it. Kelly later reflected on this moment with characteristic understatement. It's not the conventional way for a young engineer to begin employment. He would never work anywhere else. That quote from Kelly's first week on the job captures everything you need to know about him. He wasn't reckless, he was precise. He didn't say things he couldn't back up. But when he knew he was right, he said so regardless of who was in the room or how convenient it might be to hear that. Hal Hibbard, who became Kelly's boss, mentor, and collaborator, later said Kelly was the most naturally gifted engineer he'd ever seen. He could do in his head what other engineers needed a room full of people and a bank of instruments to calculate. But what really set him apart wasn't just the intelligence, it was the judgment. He understood what mattered and what didn't. He could cut through complexity to the essential problem faster than anyone in the room. He would need all of that in the years ahead. The Lockheed of the early 30s was not a buttoned-up aerospace corporation. It was a cash-strapped startup, always one bad quarter from going under. And that made it a magnet for people who didn't fit in anywhere else. Like Wiley Post, the one-eyed barnstormer who discovered the jet stream. He was in and out of the hangars constantly. Laura Ingalls set speed records out of the local airport flying a Lockheed plane. And then there was Roscoe Turner, a barnstormer and record chaser who showed up to the factory in a bowler hat and a full-length fur coat over his tailored suit and jobbers. His most distinctive feature, though, by a considerable distance, was his co-pilot, a lion named Gilmore. And Kelly Johnson helped all three improve their experimental planes. Then there was Amelia Earhart. Kelly modified Amelia's Lockheed Vega for her solo Atlantic crossing in 1932. He helped prep her Electra for the round-the-world attempt. They worked together closely for years, and by all accounts, genuinely liked each other. A year or two after this photo was taken, Amelia departed Miami, heading east, got as far as the Central Pacific, and vanished. Kelly was shaken. This was a friend, someone he'd worked alongside, whose plane he knew intimately. He spent years trying to figure out what happened. He concluded that she'd simply run out of fuel. Her navigator, Fred Noonan, was hungover and had failed her. In the early days, Lockheed had a pet bulldog named Contact. They also had a pet customer, Howard Hughes. One of the most famous men in America, and by the late 30s, one of Lockheed's most important clients. He approached Robert Gross in 1938 with a very specific ask. a commercial airliner that could fly coast to coast nonstop at 300 miles an hour, very appropriate timing, carrying 20 sleeping passengers in a pressurized cabin. The plane that Kelly and Hull designed, the Constellation, transformed Lockheed from a scrappy military contractor into a company that could build the future of commercial aviation. Many considered it to be the most beautiful plane ever built. And Howard was involved in every detail. He was very challenging to work with. He basically lived at the hangar, preferred working at night, and was known to take the controls on test flights, whether anyone wanted him to or not. When Britain fell under German attack, they needed planes desperately. The Hudson bomber was Lockheed's answer. Kelly personally made the trip to England on the Queen Mary to meet with the RAF, and when they rejected his first proposal, he redesigned it from end to end over 72 hours in his hotel room without sleeping or showering. More than 2,000 Hudsons were built in Burbank. Britain called it a lifeline. And then Kelly designed something entirely new. A radical-looking fighter with its distinctive twin-boom tail that he developed to solve the problem of fitting two powerful engines onto one airframe. Counter-rotating propellers eliminated the torque that made other fighters predictable at high speeds. German and Japanese pilots learned to fear it. Ace pilot Richard Bond flew a P-38 to 40 kills over the Pacific. And it was a small squadron of P-38s that flew for hours a few hundred feet above the Pacific to shoot down Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor. But Kelly was already thinking about what came next. I don't know what happened to the photo on the left, sorry. I swear that's not what the P looks like. In the spring of 1943, Kelly Johnson found himself in an airfield with the commanding general of the Air Corps, who was worried. The Germans had jets, and the US needed to catch up fast. Kelly assured him he could build a jet and have it flying in 6 months. Then he went back to Burbank and told his boss what he'd just promised. But Robert Groves and Hall Hibbard believed in this kid by now. They said yes, with conditions. You can do it, Kelly. You just have to find your own space, build your own team, and keep that team small. Because Lockheed had a war to support, and a lot of Hudsons and P-38s to make. So Kelly annexed a parking lot next to the wind tunnel across from some train tracks, built the desks out of engine boxes, and ordered a literal circus tent to put over the top. He picked 25 engineers and 30 machinists, and it didn't take him 6 months. That team built America's first jet fighter, the XP-80 Shooting Star, in 143 days. And the scrappy operation that performed this miracle got a name, the Skunk Works, from a Little Abner cartoon. Kelly hated it, but it stuck. Later, Al Cap threatened to sue, and it was changed from Skunk Works to Skunk Works. And over time, that term became something else entirely, a widely used term to describe small, autonomous, intensely focused teams given permission to do the impossible. After the war, Kelly formalized his philosophy in what became known as the Skunk Works Rules, 14 principles on how to run a development program. They're worth reading when you have some time, because almost every one of them is a direct repudiation of how large organizations actually work. These rules were written in 1943. The Skunk Works still uses them today. Oh, whoops. I'm missing, there was supposed to be an F-104 slide. All right, well, just imagine there's an F-104 picture up here. If the XP-80 had proved the concept, the F-104 proved the philosophy was repeatable. The Starfighter was Kelly's response to the Korean War. American pilots were coming back with reports of Chinese MiG that could climb and accelerate in ways no Western fighter could match. He asked the pilots what they wanted. They said, speed and climb. Everything else was secondary. So Kelly gave them a missile with a man in it. It set 7 world records in 1958 alone and won the Collier Trophy for aviation's highest honor. Then, in 1954, the CIA showed up with a request that sounded impossible. Build a plane that could overfly the Soviet Union at 70,000 feet, above the ceiling of every Soviet fighter and missile, and photograph everything below on the ground. No problem, Kelly said. He'd already been thinking about it. The U-2 was ready to fly in 8 months, ahead of time and under budget. Kelly actually returned money to the CIA. Its first operational overflight of the Soviet Union in 1956 was wildly successful, and for 4 years, the U-2 gathered intelligence that transformed our understanding of the Soviet threat, the bomber gap, the missile gap, the true state of the Soviet industry. Nearly everything Washington thought it knew about Soviet military capability, it knew because of a plane built in a secret facility in Burbank, California. And the Soviets had tracked it on radar from its first flight. On May Day, 1960, the Soviets finally got one. An SA-2 missile brought down a U-2 over Russian territory. The pilot, the famous Francis Gary Powers, survived, parachuted into Soviet territory, and was captured. When the government threw Powers under the bus, when politicians and officials quietly suggested he'd acted improperly, that he should have destroyed the plane, or that a real American would have used the poison pen, Kelly was unequivocal. Powers had done exactly what he should have done. Kelly designed the survival equipment. He knew what the instructions said. He knew what a pilot faced in that situation. And so he said so publicly at a moment when it was not the popular position. Powers was later exonerated by a Senate inquiry, and when the CIA cut him loose, Kelly hired him to work at Lockheed. Kelly also knew that the Soviets were going to get the Angel, which is why he had been designing its successor for years.
What's the Angel?
Oh, sorry, that's what they called the U-2. That was his nickname for the U-2. And the code name for the operation was Archangel. So, the Blackbird was the successor. Designed to be unreachable, a plane that cruised at Mach 3.2, faster than a rifle's bullet, and at a speed at which a missile fired would never close the distance. The plane was long gone before it arrived. The Blackbird also violated one of Kelly's favorite maxims, one miracle per program. Every piece of it had to be reinvented. The titanium was the only material that could withstand the heat generated at Mach 3, but the US didn't produce enough to make these planes. So the CIA secretly purchased through intermediaries from the Soviet Union. The Blackbird flew for decades. It was retired in 1990 and has never been equaled. As of today, it remains the fastest air-breathing aircraft ever built. Everything I've described so far, the U-2, the SR, the XP-80, built in a regular building in downtown Burbank by a team of a few hundred people at most. When a new plane was ready, they'd work through the night, disassemble it, load the pieces onto trailers, drive it through the city streets after dark, past houses, past diners, past anyone who happened to be up late, out into the desert, to a place you might have heard of, Area 51. The CIA called it Groom Lake or Watertown. Lockheed called it the Ranch. The pilots who flew there sometimes called it the area. And when Kelly's plane started flying higher and faster than anything on Earth, UFO sightings suddenly spiked. Two Presidential Medals of Freedom, 2 Collier Trophies, the National Medal of Science, virtually every honor American aviation can bestow, Kelly Johnson received. He accepted them with characteristic modesty and just went back to work. But the thing he was most proud of, according to his third and final wife, was the Guggenheim Medal, because it recognized art and design, which is relevant to where I'm about to go. In 1975, Kelly handed the Skunk Works to his successor, Ben Rich. He had chosen Ben himself, a thermodynamics engineer whose mind worked in ways that reminded Kelly at least a little of himself when he was younger. Kelly stayed on as senior advisor. He came to the office most days. He reviewed designs, offered opinions, which he never lacked. And they were still taken seriously even if they weren't acted on. One thing he really didn't like was this. Ben Rich's first major program as the director of the Skunk Works was stealth. The idea had been around for years. Kelly himself had pursued it, but the physics seemed impossible. A plane genuinely invisible to radar required shapes so aerodynamically unstable, no pilot could control the plane. He was almost right. A mathematician named Dennis Overholser figured out that you could calculate a plane's radar signature mathematically, and that a faceted shape could scatter radar returns so effectively that a plane could essentially disappear. Of course, you also had to fly it by wire. And the Skunk Works built it. The F-117 Nighthawk first flew in '81 and remained secret for 7 years. On the first night of the Gulf War, F-117 struck 37% of all strategic targets in Iraq, despite flying only 2.5% of combat sorties. They took 0 losses. Kelly was right that it was nearly impossible. Ben built it anyway. That's what the Skunk Works was always about. By the time the F-117 flew, Kelly was in his 70s. He'd suffered strokes, his memory was going. The world had changed around him too. The Cold War was winding down, Lockheed had merged, restructured, grown into this massive defense contractor. The opposite of everything Kelly had built the Skunk Works to be. The Pentagon wanted oversight committees and monthly reviews and documentation for everything. But Kelly had built a system that ran on trust, on small teams, on the authority of one person who could say yes without asking anyone. And that world was disappearing. "57 years. The circus tent, the leaky building, the parking lot next to the wind tunnel. The most consequential aerospace work in American history, done quietly by a small group of extraordinary people with almost no one knowing about it. The Skunk Works still exists, of course, and it still operates in many ways by the rules Kelly wrote in 1943. But the original facility, that building where he'd spent his career, where the U-2 and the Blackbird and the F-117 were born, it's gone now. The Skunk Works is out in Palmdale now, but its former home, it's a strip mall with a Michaels and a Best Buy. The only sign of what used to be there is an ersatz constellation sitting on top of a telephone pole. It's a little sad, I have to say. Kelly spent the last 2 years of his life in a hospital, battling a series of health conditions. He only left once after going in for the last time, and that was to see the final flight of the final Blackbird, which buzzed Burbank 3 times after burners on. Kelly died on December 21st, 1990. He was 80. And Lockheed ran a full-page ad in the LA Times with just this graphic. The skunk with a tear coming out of its eye. I like to close with this. It's the simplest of the many ways to explain the Skunk Works philosophy in Kelly's own words. All it really is the application of common sense to some pretty tough problems. Classic understatement from Kelly Johnson. But this shot, I talked so much about Kelly at work, but this was the other place he loved. This was Star Lane. This is a ranch out near Reagan's Ranch around Santa Barbara. And I didn't put this in the show, but what's funny about this ranch, he spent all of his free time there riding horses, but he sort of treated the ranch the way he treated the Skunk Works. And among the things he did was design the roads so that in the event of a war, they could be used by the military so that, they were all up to grade and wide enough to handle tanks and long enough to land planes. And he sent a letter to the Pentagon, which I don't think was ever even acknowledged, basically saying, my ranch is yours if you ever need it. But it was Kelly's happy place. And then when he died, his wife sold it at a tremendous profit. So that's sort of the Cliff Notes story of Kelly Johnson. I mean, I wrote a 420-page book about it. He's an amazing man, which I probably don't have to tell most of the people in this room. And the operation he built is, probably never to be equal. And I'm happy to answer questions. We can have a conversation. But thanks for coming out.
And you can talk about your book too, and people can get them.
Yeah, so it's based on the book I wrote, which is from the first slide, I guess, called The Impossible Factory. I don't actually sell the books, it's my publisher's problem. But if you want to buy one at some point, I did bring some nameplate. These are what we call book plates, so I'd be happy to sign them for anyone who wants them. You stick them on the inside of the book if you're ever to buy one later. But happy to answer any questions or talk about airplanes.
Be sure and repeat questions.
Repeat the question. Do you want me to? Yeah, sorry, I'll stand up for everyone.
Well, one question I have, I've read somewhere where the Swedes had tracked a SR-71 coming out of Russia, and the Russians had directed a Foxbat after it, and they claimed they got within missile range. Do you know anything about that?
I've heard that story. I don't think there's ever no confirmation of it being true, but I have heard that story. And I should have said one of the I don't want to say that the end of Kelly's career was sad. He did amazing things, but he always considered it a failure. I mean, mostly on the Pentagon's part, but even on his own part, that he was never able to make a fighter or a bomber. Really, what he wanted to make was an interceptor version of the Blackbird, because he felt like nothing on the planet could surpass it. And so for more than a decade at the end of his career, he tried to make one. He spent countless hours arguing with the Pentagon.
Well, that was the YF.
Well, wasn't that the H-12?
Yeah, well,
It's a YF-12.
he made a prototype of it, but he could not get the Pentagon to buy into it. Yeah, the YF-12,
Yeah.
exactly. And McNamara turned out to be his nemesis. They were not good friends.
With RA-12 up front, when I'm giving tours, I usually try to make a connection between the A-12 and Project Gusto, which was a competition between Convair and stuff. Do you talk about that at all? And supposedly what I read, I'm not sure how accurate it is. Probably wasn't really a competition.
Well, it wasn't much. Yeah, so Gusto was there. It wasn't much of a competition. It was about as much of a competition as the F-117. When they did the radar cross-section contest. I mean, that was technically an open bid stealth program that Lockheed competed for, but apparently the RCS of the Blackbird was, or of the Nighthawk was exponentially less. I mean, Ben Rich once famously sat at a conference table at the Pentagon and they were like throwing things at him. Is it going to be the size of a basketball? Is it the size of a Volkswagen? And he pulled ball bearings out of his pocket and rolled them across the table and said, it's the size of a ball bearing.
Was the concept of the faceted configuration of the F-117 based on a paper by a Russian?
Yeah, so it's sort of like the incredible reality that the titanium used to build the plane that overflew Soviet territory was sourced from Russia. The paper that enabled the F-117 to be brought to reality was written by a Russian mathematician. And it's unclear whether it was never classified. It's unclear if the Russians didn't recognize the importance of it, didn't think it was significant. It's hard to imagine why they would think that. But yeah, Dennis Oberholzer found it, and it unlocked, made the F-117 possible. But that's completely, Mitsev, I think is the guy's name. Incredible that that's true. So both of those planes, in some way, in a very real way, owe their existence to the Soviet Union. Thanks.
How much effort did the Russians put into bringing one of those down, and did that continue the whole life that it was doing its surveillance mission? And
A lot of effort. I mean, they were constantly, the SA-2 that took down the U-2, they continued to work on that system to get it higher and faster. I mean, nothing really got very close. It became much more about politics. I mean, I think the reason the Blackbird stopped flying was not really about fear of them getting shot down. It was more about not wanting to cause political issues.
Well, actually, there was one fired at, I was telling about my friend. He was the guy that was shot at.
He was shot at over Vietnam, right? Or
Yeah, but what happened was, it apparently took, the SA-2 took about a minute to get up there, okay, from the fire, okay? And it was 28 miles before they could fire the thing. Well, the airplane's going 28 miles a minute. So by the time the missile was fired, the airplane was pretty much either there or gone. And what happened with my friend, Maury Rosenberg is his name, what happened was the back seater is monitoring. And sometimes the people on the ground would say, well, we're tracking you, we can see you, right? And they'd send a missile. And then they would send a missile as if they had fired the missile, which would always scare the hell out of guys. But this time he said, oh shit, they really fired, because they could tell that the missile was talking back to the ground. So he knew they had actually fired. And Maury said he looked out and he saw the big old white pole coming up, so he turned.
And I think the plane got a picture of it, actually. I don't know if that picture's ever been declassified. I heard that there's a photo of a missile
I don't
chasing.
know about that, but he said he got back on the ground and they said, because they tracked everywhere where they went. And when he got back on the ground, they said, you turned early. And why? He said, well, they fired a missile at me. And then it became a big international incident. I mean, they armed all the airplanes as if, it was during the Reagan administration.
Yeah.
That's the true story.
Didn't an A-12 on Black Shield get ticked by a piece of SA-2? It came, one of them it didn't do any damage. I mean,
I don't know if that's true.
Well, I just heard that.
Yeah,
Actually, I think I even read it, so. but-
we didn't, like, the missions themselves are not, much more about the development and the testing, the book, the research I was focusing on, so I didn't read probably every account of every flight. I don't think there was ever one really in danger of coming down. I mean, a few of them crashed.
Well, I mean, they blew up way off, and it just got a little bit of a.
Which is also what happened to the U-2. That wasn't a direct hit. So the SA-2 that took down the U-2 didn't actually hit the plane. At least no one will ever know definitively. That's what Power said, and Kelly believed him based on how he analyzed the photos of the wreckage. But it got close enough that pieces of the missile struck. And obviously the U-2 was a very fragile bird. It was, I mean, one of my favorite facts about it is that its fastest speed was only a small amount of difference from its slowest speed. So it basically had, its margin of error was very, very slight. Which was incredible. If you think about the feat of the pilots here, they had to be in there for 6, 8, 10, I've heard of an 11-hour flight. And again, I don't have to tell most of you that those seats are probably not very comfortable. Not to mention you're in a pressurized suit, essentially an early space suit. You haven't eaten very much because you don't want to go to the bathroom. Quite a feat of endurance to fly either of those planes.
You said there were a couple of SR-71s that were lost. Were any of them outside of the U.S. or were they all test and evaluation?
No, one went down over the Pacific. One of the pilots survived. The backseater got caught up in his parachute and drowned. Sadly.
But there were no big recovery efforts involved in trying to get the...
I think it sunk and there was no worry of that thing being recovered. There were, one of the most famous crashes during testing, a Nevada rancher happened upon the wreckage before the security team could get there. You know, by the time the security team got there, they obviously pulled him aside and handed him a piece of paper and said, like, you don't ask what that is, and this never happened, and please sign this piece of paper. And if I ever see this in a newspaper, you'll go to prison immediately. And that story only came out later through the CIA declassified security reports.
Yeah, if I can add, that pilot lives up in La Costa. Bill, what's it, Bill Welsh is his name?
Oh, yes.
And
Ray Torek was the one who died.
he was over the Four Corners, and what happened was, the story was, the airplane broke apart as he was entering into a turn. He just refueled, and they were testing trim drag, and as he pulled up like this, the airplane pitched up, and he went full nose down like that, and the next thing he knew, he couldn't see, and he was falling. And he thought, well, this is what it's like to be dead. Oh, that's not so bad. But then he realized he heard the wind, figured he must be alive. So he hears the wind, and now he's worried about his face shield. He can't see, it's all frozen over. After that, they heated the heat shields. But anyway, he said, well, at 15,000 feet, the chute's going to go off. And he said, finally, the chute went off. He opened up, and he said, he looks down, there's an antelope looking at him. And it moves. And he said, he's pulling up his parachute, right? And he hears this guy in back of him say, can I help you? This is the middle of nowhere. And it turned out what happened was the guy heard the explosion, and he had his own helicopter. He heard the airplane, boom, blow up in the air. And as he's floating down, he rushes over there and he helps him. And then they went to the other pilot, or the other backseater RSO, who was dead, unfortunately. And then they got in the helicopter going to Tonopah, and he said he was going flat out in that helicopter. He said, I don't like helicopters, but I see it's in the red. And he says, slow down, man, I'm okay. But he wasn't hurt at all, but he was a test pilot for a long time with, in fact, he was flying the L-1011 when he was 85 years old, when they launched that Pegasus missile.
He lives nearby?
He lives up in La Costa. Well, he did. It's about 5 years ago, I think. I interviewed him. I mean, Maury Rosenberg, who was the SR-71 pilot.
I'll have to connect me.
And they were talking about, well, how fast does it really go? And I always asked Maury, I said, well, how much throttle did you have left at 3.2 Mach? And
They had some. I mean, I've heard they thought they could get to 3.5.
yeah, well, he said he had it up to 3.45 or something like that. I think there's a plaque on the wall, and he got to 85,000 feet or something like that. So.
Cruising at 3.2. I mean, the other pilot who was killed in testing, by the way, was what happened in that case. It turned out he had modified his headrest for comfort in some way, and he didn't separate from the ejection seat, and he came down, died on impact. So I mean, from that point on, they obviously very strict rules that these seats won't be touched by anyone.
Is it known how high Gary Powers was when they got hit?
No, I mean, that's not, the exact height has not been declassified, but I mean, I think they were, the missiles, I mean, you could fly at 70,000, those planes, the missiles were getting very close, if not actually exceeding that height by that time. Also, the Russians were constantly modifying their fighters to try and get higher and higher. And then ultimately, I mean, maybe some of you know this, what they would fly essentially in certain situations would fly like squadrons of planes under the U-2 at an altitude to essentially block its ability to photograph the ground below. That was one of their defenses when they couldn't reach it. But yeah, I think the missiles were, if it didn't get to 70, it was very close.
Interesting side note, Bob and I both flew for American Airlines, and one of our regular co-pilots was a gentleman named Rod Dykeman, who was the SR-71 wing commander.
Oh.
He's been on the military channel a number of times. But one of the comments I remember him making to me was, and this may have been based on Francis Gary Powers' shoot down, but any of us that have gone through SEER school know it's about a 1 week evolution, and they simulate, more than simulate, torture and that sort of thing. He said the one thing that they tried to get him to get the Russians or whoever shot him down to do was to notify that he was still alive. And, because typically if they would have captured him, it would have been,
Paraded out.
Yeah, exactly. So it was like, make sure that somehow you can convey to them that you're still alive, and we'll do our best to get you out of there. But it was a 2-week program of SEER school that he went through.
Oh, he did, because they released photos of, they released fake photos of the wreckage first, and then ultimately real photos of the wreckage, I think before they revealed that he was alive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, he tragically later died in a helicopter crash as an LA traffic reporter. Apparently ran out of fuel. I don't know how that happens to someone who's been flying his whole life.
Well, when they shot down the F-117, was it in Bosnia when they shot one down?
Yeah.
And apparently the thing is visible from the rear. You can't see it from the front, but you can see it from the rear. And somehow they coordinated everything, because they knew, typical military, they flew the same routes, the same times every day. Pretty soon they figured it out. And I remember when they showed it on television with some, guy jumping up and down on the wing, and they said, well, we don't even know if this is true or not. And I said, well, that's the emblem from the 8th Attack Fighter Squadron. Yeah, it's real.
Well, it apparently got it was obviously invisible from the front, but it got its nickname. Kelly gave it the nickname the Hopeless Diamond because when it was about to be tested, the RCS tested for the first time, I think, or maybe not the first time, but and he looked at it from the front and he just said, Ben, this thing has no chance. Because Kelly's obviously thinking of it only in the context of his understanding of planes itself, and which was quite primitive, and he thought, he said that's the hopeless diamond, right? Like this thing stands no chance. But of course, he wasn't a mathematician, and it proved to be incredibly true. I mean, an amazing machine. I don't know, anyone here knows someone who's flown one, but not possible without the computers.
Would you please make a comment about the very highly specialized fuel, the JP7, and how they came up with this, with the very high flash point, to the point you have to use another compound, which is as you know, the triethylborane. It's fascinating to me how they came up with this.
Yeah, it was Richard Bong, I believe, who was then working for Union, one of the fuel companies. I can't now. So many names in my head. Shell, was it Shell? I think. Yeah, they couldn't find a fuel to run. They could not. There was not a fuel on Earth that actually could make the Blackbird fly. So they had to develop an experimental compound that involved, I believe, a element that's in bug spray. Is that right? Do you know? So for a summer, I believe they cornered the entire market on, and I have not. I don't remember what specific chemical it is that was, for an entire summer, basically there was no compound to make bug spray in the United States because it was needed to make the fuel that made the Blackbird fly. That anecdote's in the story, in the book. I don't exactly remember the name of it, but then Kelly, because he knew Richard Bong from World War II, made sort of a backroom deal so that that was never made public. But,
Bong died in 46.
what's that?
I said Richard Bong died in 46.
Oh, wait, not Bong then. Oh,
Somebody else.
yeah. Well, no, a very famous World War II aviator. God. Well, anyway. Actually, it'll take me a few minutes to find it, but it was a World War II aviator.
Did either of the spy planes have countermeasure suite? Or did they just not worry about it because they were
They didn't. I
untouchable?
mean, the U-2 didn't have, the weight was so important that it couldn't carry anything. I think later Blackbirds did, but that also it was untouchable essentially.
Do you think there's any truth to the rumor that someone was working on a replacement for the 71?
Someone at Lockheed, or you mean some?
I can't
What
answer.
about the SR-72 they claim?
I mean, that they've never talked about that publicly, and that's not in any of the papers that have been
Well,
declassified.
it had the nickname Orion.
Yeah, I did not turn up any, and I went through all of the declassified papers with Skunk Works that I was able to get, most of which are at the Huntington, including Kelly's papers, so that program wasn't in the papers.
So it was Aurora. What was it? Did you ever hear of Aurora?
No, what's,
That was rumored to be the follow-on to hydrogen operated, I think.
well, there was a hydrogen program, which was before, well, actually early in the early A, it wasn't A12, it was probably A1 or early in the Oxcart program trying to develop a plane that could fly fast enough and high enough. There was a hydrogen plane program at Lockheed that they extensively researched liquid hydrogen as a fuel. Ben Rich was a young engineer at that time. They used this area of the facility in Burbank called the bunker, and they were testing fuel handling and explosion. So they basically did a bunch of small explosions under the runway at what's now the Burbank Airport. And actually developed a number of handling and transport expertise that became invaluable in the space program, but Kelly ultimately had to tell the Pentagon that a hydrogen-powered plane was impossible. It would have had to be so huge and would have required, it was something like all of the hydrogen on the entire West Coast for 1 year, basically, in order to run a program. But the main problem was that the plane would have been gigantic, like untenably large to fly. But I was, talking to some Skunk Works people yesterday, and that, it was one of the things that Kelly considered a failure because he had to go back to the Pentagon and say, I tried and it didn't work. But ultimately, like, incredible amount of expertise on handling that I think was quite valuable to the space program.
He was also responsible for canceling the
XFV-1, the vertical takeoff?
well, the rocket. That was,
Oh, yeah.
That was going to go further. Not the rocket, but the M21 and the D21.
Yeah, the D-21 drone.
Right. Yeah.
I thought you meant the vertical takeoff. That failed too. But yes, the D-21 drone, which was the first drone, a supersonic drone that actually did work. It just, that caused another of the Blackbird accidents was, I mean, can you imagine that the Blackbird had to be flying fast enough to get the drone so you've got a drone detaching from a plane that's flying, I don't know, Mach 2 or something, and then it itself has to detach and take off. A very dangerous operation that did work on a number of times, and then one time it didn't. It took off and immediately veered right, I believe, and ran into its own plane and took down an SR. And then it was later modified to take off from B-52.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, they did use them. They used them, I think they flew into China.
They did. Yeah, the Chinese got one. I believe there's one in a museum in China.
And they were designed to be recovered, to be a film.
I mean, yeah, the film recovery, which ultimately was used on the Corona program too, is incredible. That they would, I believe it was a C-130, would fly. They would drop the film from the satellite, but originally from those drones, and then a C-130, I think, would.
He did that.
Look,
Oh my God, you did it!
Yeah.
I just happened to be giving a talk
Oh,
downstairs.
one of my favorite stories is that.
So I got,
That's the parachute?
well, from one of the practice missions.
Oh my God, well.
Yeah. Got books and stuff.
Well, anyway, oh, is that the actual hook?
It's a hook from a recovery.
That's amazing. So were you on the Corona or?
Yes.
Did you practice on the D-21 too?
No, I was out by then. I was on the first mission.
Wow, that's cool. I should have known someone in this room would have done that. But yeah,
Real-
Chuck worked at Corona when we couldn't say Corona.
what'd you have to call it?
Right.
Well, you just didn't say anything, right?
No, you didn't. We called it Discoverer, and it was supposed, when it first flew, they called it Discoverer and said it was a biosatellite. So the first 38 that were launched, well, everybody knew, the Russians knew.
Well,
It
the
was
first bunch of them blew up, right?
Huh?
Bunch of them blew up, right? The first 11 or something?
Yeah, the first one that came down was 13.
Yeah,
They had 12 failures. I mean, would that work today? And then so, in August of 1960, they caught it. The first one went in the ocean. And they brought it back to Washington, and it's at the Smithsonian. And the one that really had film in it is now in the Air Force Museum.
And 13, were you on?
Yes.
You caught the first one?
No, I was on the mission, but I wasn't, we flew it back to Sunnyvale.
That was LMSC, right? Those missiles in space, the Corona?
What?
That was Lockheed Missiles in Space, right?
Yes.
Same CIA program manager as Oxcart, John Parengoski. Actually, same program manager as Azorian 2. The same guy led those 3 programs from the CIA. The Deep Sea, the Blackbird, and Corona. But yeah, the D-21, it's incredible. I mean, I opened the book with, the most famous interview Kelly ever gave was on 60 Minutes. He didn't do a lot of interviews over his career for obvious reasons, and then in the early 80s he did this appearance on 60 Minutes, and in that interview they were asking him about the future, and this is, mind you, in the early 80s, like the future of it, where's it going? You have a Mach 3.2 plane, they're trying to get him to talk about stealth, and he said, honestly, the future is drones and video conferences. And he predicted the reality that we are living in today in the early 1980s, because he was saying, why will we need to fly around the world to meetings? We'll just be able to join, there weren't laptops at that time, but we'll just be able to look at each other on screens. And also, why do we need to risk pilots? We'll have drones, it will just fly themselves. And he was pretty prescient.
And pilots drink too much too.
No comment on that one. Wow, that was a nice surprise. I love the Corona program too.
I worked on Corona in '68, so 8 years after him, and we still couldn't say Corona.
What year were you allowed to start talking about it? And when did they?
You guys all know, when you get out, they tell you cannot talk about this and this and this, and they give you a big list of what you can't talk about, but they never tell you when you can.
I believe that.
And usually you find out because you see it on the TV news, or somebody publishes a book or something.
What's funny, I spoke at City of Burbank last night, and Steve Justice, who was a longtime skunk, who was on various programs, including the F-117, and early in his career on the Blackbird. And I asked him, we were sitting on stage, and I said, do you want to tell the ball bearing story? And he said, I can't tell that story. And I said, what do you mean? It's in Ben Rich's book. He's like, yeah, but nobody ever told me that I can talk about it. He's like, I can't talk about RCS on stage. He's like, my former boss is here. I'm like, it was in a book. But to your point, I think, it's not like they call you and say, by the way, feel free to tell your family.
Well, there were people that were prosecuted for talking about stuff they shouldn't have, and they said, well, I saw it in the New York Times or whatever, and they said, yeah, but it's still classified.
Yeah, same experience doing the Glomar Explorer book, because that one was very CIA specific, and so I met with a lot of retired spooks, and some of them were very helpful because they have, basically they know it's been published and they can talk about it, but other ones were just like, no one has told me I can talk about this, so I can't talk to you about it. I'm like, I respect that, that's totally fine. And we had a really lively conversation last night in the questions with people in the audience who were children of skunks, who just talked about how they never knew what their dads did. Like, they worked at the Skunk Works for decades, and she's like, one woman was like, all my friends knew exactly what their dads did, and I never knew. I just knew that he went to this place and did things that I wasn't allowed to know. And it wasn't until he was retired that I started to hear about these things that he worked on, which is a kind of an incredible thought. I mean, it's trying on families, I would imagine.
Josh, did you have to run your book through the DOD before?
No, this one not. Actually, neither of them did because they're all based on declassified. There's nothing classified. Like I was a little bit more worried about the last one because Azorian famously led to the so-called GLOMAR exemption that can neither confirm nor deny. That comes from the GLOMAR Explorer program, and that project was not declassified until, even though it had been widely covered in newspapers because things leaked and the LA Times got a hold of some things, it never was actually officially declassified until the 2010s. And so, I mean, as a journalist, I don't have to run my stuff through, what do they call it, PD? Whatever it is, you mail your manuscript to a PO box in Washington, D.C. If you're a former agency employee, you mail your manuscript to a PO box. Literally, this is how it still works. And then they read it and tell you what you can. And it comes back with a lot of like black highlighting, I think. In my case, I didn't have to. And actually the CIA, to the extent that they can be cooperative, they were. I mean, it was kind of funny because my stepmom was in the agency. My brother's best friend was a very high-ranking analyst at the agency. So he had introduced me to the Public Information Office, and they took a meeting, and I went to Langley and met with them. And they were really friendly, and they were like, this is great. This should be a great book. And I was like, okay, how can you guys help? And they were like, we can't really help, but we're like excited that you're doing it. And I said, no, you can't. There's no like interviews you can facilitate. And they were like, no, not really, but we're not going to tell people not to talk to you. And that ultimately became the most valuable thing, especially with, I mean, I was talking to these incredible engineers who were in their 80s, telling me stories of how they were capturing radar data from the Soviet Union. And I was able to tell them that I had been to Langley and had gotten their blessing to talk about these things, and so I got some great stories.
Yeah, I could imagine.
I mean, they were capturing signals that were bouncing off the moon down in Florida. They were like hiking into the mountains outside Tehran because that was about the closest you could get to the Russian border, and living in like yurts and drinking yak milk and like all to capture. And these are not like, you know, operation guys. These are analysts, scientists, engineers. Like, I mean, the lengths that we went to are incredible.
How much of that Russian submarine did they recover?
I wish I could tell you definitively. I mean, certainly about a third of it. There's never been a true accounting of exactly what they got, and I don't think we ever will. I was talking about this beforehand. Like, it's almost certain that they did get the code book, which I think is probably the most valuable thing.
Why don't you kind of review from the top headlines about the GLOMAR, because I don't think most of them even know about it.
Oh, okay. I mean, tell us.
We have plenty of time apparently, so.
Can I sit down?
Yeah, Jim's not here yet, so.
All right. So you did some of you know
I'll shut this off.
Some of you know the GLOMAR Explorer story?